Hello students, this is Rekha from Government Science College. So today we shall discuss about the theories which explains the opening and closing of stomata. So what are stomata? Stomata are minute pores of elliptical shape surrounded by two specialized epidermal cells called the guard cells. The guard cells are kidney shaped in dicots and dumbbell shaped in monocots. The wall of the guard cells surrounding the pore is thick and inelastic due to the presence of a secondary layer of cellulose, and the rest of the wall is thin, elastic, and permeable. Each guard cell has a cytoplasmic lining and a central vacuole containing the cell sap. Its cytoplasm contains a nucleus and a number of chloroplasts. The epidermal cells surrounding the guard cells are called as subsidiary cells, which support the movement of the guard cells. There are four important theories to explain the movement of stomata or the opening and closing of stomata. These are the theory of photosynthesis in guard cells, starch-sugar interconversion theory, theory of glycolate metabolism, and the active potassium transport or potassium pump theory or the active potassium pump theory. So let us study the first theory, that is the theory of photosynthesis in guard cells. This theory was proposed by Van Mol in the year 1856. He observed that the stomata open in daylight and close at night. In the presence of light, photosynthesis occurs in the guard cells, and as a result, the carbohydrates are synthesized, which increases the osmotic pressure of the guard cells. So, this can be explained as follows. So, when light falls on the guard cells, the chloroplast present in the guard cells undergo photosynthesis. So, there is the formation of sugar, and this increases the osmotic pressure of the cell sap, and as a result, end osmosis, that is, entry of water from the neighboring epidermal cells into the guard cells, which increases the turgidity of the guard cells, and thus the stomata opens. But this theory is not accepted because of a few demerits. The first is the rate of photosynthesis by the guard cells is too slow, and the chloroplast of the guard cells are poorly developed and incapable of performing active photosynthesis. And the second theory is starch-sugar interconversion theory. So according to this theory, so the opening and closing of stomata is due to the interconversion of starch into sugar and sugar into starch. So in the year 1926, Sayre observed that stomata remain open in neutral or alkaline pH even in the dark, and close in acidic pH even in the light. So Eve proposed that the pH determines the interconversion of starch into sugar and vice versa. So stomata opens in alkaline pH during daytime, and the stomata remains closed during nighttime in acidic pH. So he proposed that pH is responsible for the opening and closing of stomata due to the interconversion of starch into sugar and sugar into starch. So the steps involved in opening and closing of stomata is as follows. So during the daytime, in the guard cells, that is during the light, carbon dioxide is consumed in photosynthesis. So, as a result, the pH raises, and the increase in the pH favors the hydrolysis of starch into sugars. Sugars increase the osmotic pressure of the cell sap of the guard cells, and the water enters into the guard cells due to the raise in osmotic pressure. The turgor pressure increases in the guard cells. Guard cells become turgid and it changes its shape. As a result, stomata opens. During night times, that is in the dark, in the guard cells, carbon dioxide released from the respiration accumulates in the intercellular spaces. There is no photosynthesis. pH falls down, that is, the guard cells show acidic reaction. A decrease in the pH favors the formation of starch from soluble sugars present in the cell, and due to the presence of starch, osmotic pressure falls down. Water moves out of the guard cells to subsidiary cells, and osmotic pressure, turgor pressure, and the volume of the guard cells decreases. Guard cells become flaccid due to the loss of water and changes its shape. As a result, stomata closes. And the next theory is the modified theory of starch sugar, which is called as the theory of starch glucose interconversion theory. So, this theory is proposed by Stewart in the year 1964. So, this theory was proposed after the discovery of the presence of certain enzymes in the guard cells. So, according to this theory, stomata opens when starch is converted into glucose by certain enzymes, and the stomata closes when glucose is converted into starch, again in the presence of few enzymes. So, in daylight, there is high rate of photosynthesis in the mesophyll cells. The removal of carbon dioxide from the intercellular spaces takes place. Increase of pH in the guard cells, and the conversion or the hydrolysis of starch to sugar by enzymes. Increase of osmotic pressure in the guard cells, end osmosis of water in the guard cells, which increases the turgidity of the guard cells, and the stomata opens. So, in dark, there is no photosynthesis. So, there is an increased carbon dioxide concentration, decrease in the pH of the guard cells, conversion of sugar into starch by the enzymes, decreased osmotic pressure leads to exosmosis, decrease in the turgidity of the guard cells, and the stomata closes. So, this is the summary of the mechanism of opening and closing of stomata as explained by starch sugar interconversion theory. So, the major demerits of this theory is some of the guard cells they lack starch, like as they work as those of other plants, and the carbon dioxide concentration has been found insufficient to induce any major change in the pH of the guard cells, and the closure of stomata at midday takes place without any change in the starch content. So, the next theory, the third theory, is the theory of glycolate metabolism. So, this theory was proposed by Zelich in the year 1963. So, he says that the production of glycolic acid in the guard cells is an important factor in stomatal opening. Glycolate is produced under low concentration of carbon dioxide. So he suggests that glycolate gives rise to carbohydrate, thus raising the osmotic pressure, and it also participates in the production of ATP, which provides energy which is required for the opening of stomata. So again, the demerits of this theory are it fails to explain the opening of stomata in dark. In some plants, stomata have been found to remain closed even during daytime, and the participation of ATP as a driving force for water from the epidermal cells is highly speculative. So, the last theory is the active potassium transport or potassium pump theory or theory of proton transport and hormonal regulation. So, the concept of potassium ion transport was given by Fugino, and this theory was proposed by Leavitt in the year 1974. So, according to this theory, potassium ions have been found to play a critical role in opening and closing of stomata. So, the opening and closing of stomata are the result of an active transport of potassium ions into the guard cells and out of the guard cells. The adjacent epidermal cells act as an ion storage cells for the guard cells. So, stomata opens during daytime in the presence of light and closes in the dark in the absence of light. In addition to this, plant hormones also play an important role in stomatal movement. So, the opening of stomata depends on the following conditions. So, in the presence of light, starch is metabolized into malic acid. So, when the starch is converted into malic acid, there is a decrease in starch content in the guard cells and increase in the concentration of malic acid. So, this malic acid it gets dissociated into hydrogen and malate ions. So, there is an influx of potassium ions into the guard cells, and to balance this there is an the intake of chloride ions or the uptake of chloride ions. So to balance the potassium ions there is also an influx or the uptake of chloride ions takes place. So there is the efflux of hydrogen ions from the guard cells, and as a result low carbon dioxide concentration in and around the guard cells, the pH increases, high turgor pressure in the guard cells due to endosmosis, and the stomata opens. So during the night time, that is in the absence of light, there is decreased concentration of malic acid in the guard cells. There is efflux of potassium ions and influx of hydrogen ions, which results in the acidic medium, the loss of chloride ions, increased carbon dioxide concentration in and around the guard cells, and the presence of plant growth inhibiting hormone, namely the abscisic acid, the loss of turgidity in the guard cells due to exosmosis, and the stomata closes. So, this is the diagram indicating the entry of potassium ions and chloride ions and the outflow of the hydrogen ions. So the starch is converted into malic acid. So during this conversion hydrogen ions are released. These hydrogen ions it move out from the guard cells, and there is an influx of potassium ions. So potassium, there is a formation of potassium malate. This potassium malate enter into the vacuole of the guard cells. So the osmotic entrance of water into the guard cells increase in the turgor pressure and the stomata opens. This is also the diagram which represents the influx of potassium ions into the guard cells. So what is the role of this plant hormones in the stomatal movement? So here the abscisic acid plays an important role. So the plant growth regulator, namely the cytokinin, is very much required for the active uptake of potassium ions. But the presence of abscisic acid, another plant growth inhibiting hormone, favors the closing of stomata. In dark, that is in the absence of light, abscisic acid inhibits the uptake of potassium ions by the guard cells by changing the diffusion and permeability of the guard cells. So, as a result, the potassium ions move out to the subsidiary cells, and it also prevents the efflux of hydrogen ions from the guard cells. So, abscisic acid then induces the process of acidification, and together with carbon dioxide, it helps in lowering the pH in the guard cells, making the medium acidic. At low pH, starch is synthesized, osmotic pressure falls down, water moves out of the guard cells, it becomes flaccid, and the stomata closes. So, thank you for listening my lecture.